Question asks to evaluate the extent to which and to identify and explain how Sinn Féin policy and strategy has changed since 1994. When confronted with this question, it is worth considering the official policy of Sinn Féin as outlined in its policy documents available on its website. This essentially states Sinn Féin's objective is the achieving of national self-determination and the creation of a secular socialist republic with a democratic island economy based on the principles of the Proclamation of 1916, the Democratic Programme of 1919, and the beliefs of Tone, Pearse and Connolly. In spite of the request in the question to consider change, the harking back to 1916 and 1919 and long since dead Irish nationalists, Sinn Féin appears to hold a fundamentally unchanged overarching policy. In simple terms, the policy aims of Sinn Féin might be seen as threefold: the end of British rule in Ireland, to demonstrate that Northern Ireland is an artificial and illegitimate state in the eyes of both the bulk of the Irish population and the eyes of international opinion, to undermine unionism as the bulwark in the way of Irish unity. Over all of these policy aims, these three policy aims, no fundamental change has occurred. However, the strategies used to achieve them has. The achievement of a policy, of course, like that of skinning a cat, can take many different forms. And whilst the main policy, a united Ireland, remains intact, the strategies or micro-policies have undoubtedly changed. In the lead up to 1994, Sinn Féin had largely been supportive of a twin strategy, adopted around the time of the 1980s hunger strikes, of the Danny Morrison articulated Armalite in one hand and ballot box in the other. This essentially developed more towards the ballot box, or what Sinn Féin would claim as a peace strategy or policy. The two seminal documents produced by Sinn Féin during this period and authored by Gerry Adams were Scenario for Peace in 1987 and Towards a Lasting Peace in 1992. Sinn Féin would argue that they were initiating a peace policy before the full engagement with John Hume had made the change based upon their independent analysis of the situation in Ireland post the hunger strikes. Critics would say that the 1980s had made Sinn Féin, or at least key Republicans, realise that the policy of armed campaign was getting nowhere and there was war weariness in the Republican heartlands. As Sinn Féin would have it, this amounted to the following. These engagements initially began with the SDLP through its leader John Hume. They went on to include the British government through secret negotiations with Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness from 1991 to 93, the Irish government and Irish America. It was through the engagements of the SDLP, the Dublin government and the Irish America that the Irish Peace Initiative emerged. The completing of this policy or strategy in the post-1994, and especially since the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement and then its 2006 version with St Andrews, has led to Sinn Féin's current position, which they articulate as: on the 31st of August 1994, the Irish Republican Army had taken the courageous decision, an unprecedented step, of calling a complete cessation of military operations. This provided a window of opportunity through which all could attempt to forge a new future based on justice and peace. Sinn Féin remains totally committed to its peace strategy and to the need for the peace process to be rebuilt. It calls on the British government to stop pursuing policies which have abused the process in the past and which continue to set back the goal of securing a real Irish consensus. The main change in policy has been the off-on but largely completed severance of the tradition of physical force republicanism towards a policy which still seeks the same fundamental goals but has above to be undertaken in a constitutional manner. The attainment of decommissioning at a point that would allow the DUP to enter government with Sinn Féin arguably marks a policy strategy that allows no room to return to a non-peaceful strategy. Whilst the dissident threat has grown and there have been rumblings of discontent within the Republican family, there has been no significant political challenge to this change of strategy. An area of significant policy volte-face regards the movement from not recognising the police and courts in Northern Ireland as legitimate to one of signing up, after admittedly protracted deals, to the Hillsborough Accord and the support of the reformed RUC in the form of the PSNI, which incidentally is now 10 years old. It was arguably not just Sinn Féin changing its policy, but also significant changes to policing and a recruitment policy that saw the RUC with only 8% Catholic recruitment in 2000 to 30% Catholic officers by 2011. The reference to the dissidents as traitors by Mark McGuinness following the murder of Constable Stephen Carroll and indeed other officers symbolises this change, but the fact that Jerry Kelly and Katrina Ruan are now on the police board indicate the practical change of policy on the policing issue. The change can partly be explained as necessary given Sinn Féin's position within the executive, and again critics might simply see it as tactical and possibly a way to change policing in the north in a more fundamental way than the campaign of violence or long war ever managed. These policy changes have manifested themselves in the way that Sinn Féin have contested elections, not only to Westminster, which they had done for some time and still under an abstentions platform, but also to the newly established institutions set up under Strand 1 of the Good Friday Agreement. The pictures of Gerry Adams with his face firmly outside the gates of Parliament at Stormont, at Parliament buildings in the 1980s, to those including him pictured with a hurl in front of the Carson statue in 2010, could not be more stark in their symbolism and contrast. However, the critics of Sinn Féin, such as Liam Clark and Brian Feeney, would contend that this is more a change of strategy than policy. In effect, the strategy of contesting elections and negotiating with Hume and the British and Irish governments was one that proved to work. The policy worked because by 2003 Sinn Féin had supplanted the SDLP as the main voice of Northern nationalism, and this is a position that they have subsequently consolidated at local, Assembly and Westminster in European elections. The latest electoral strategy or policy has to be to build an all-Ireland dimension to Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin can rightly argue that they're the only party in Ireland to pursue an electoral strategy across the whole island. Until recently, south of the border, this was a policy that offered only minor rewards, and as late as 2007, Gerry Adams' feeble grasp of basic economics and southern politics had consigned them to a largely irrelevant fourth or fifth party in the Dáil, and one still seen as toxic in terms of being a coalition partner. However, all changed with the economic meltdown post-2008 and has borne fruit with a 10% polling in the 2011 Dáil elections and the 14% first preference votes achieved by Mark McGuinness during his presidential election bid. The so-called 2016 project of achieving Irish unity may be the stuff of pipe dreams, but Sinn Féin can consider the policy or strategy of political engagement to be a largely successful one to date. However, commentators like Liam Clark were still talking of Sinn Féin as a Republican dodo back in 2009. He saw it as a policy light and one that still revolved around history lessons about 1916, 1969, 1981, and less to do with real policies that could address the issues that affect all on the island of Ireland. Paradoxically, seeking an all-Ireland status has rather blurred the policy of Sinn Féin, and even though it has had some success in Southern Ireland and Southern politics, its core message of unity is largely seen as a northern issue, not relevant to the majority of the 26 counties. For Liam Clark and Suzanne Breen, Sinn Féin has abandoned its defining physical force tradition, which kept it united, and left only generalised policies about cherishing the children of Ireland, and valid but inoffensive policies such as extending the tax on plastic bags to the whole of Ireland. In essence, war united a party that had not done a lot of thinking about practical policies beyond ending British imperialism. However, politics, at least that of being in power at some level, inevitably involves compromise. In the detail of policy, critics of Sinn Féin could point out that although part of a diarchy in power at Stormont, actual Sinn Féin policy ambitions have largely been parked if not abandoned as a consequence of the compromises required in a power-sharing executive. Although all of the policies outlined in their website appear to follow a watertight left-of-centre party, the reality of having to manage a declining budget and the inevitable cuts in public sector that is required has seen Sinn Féin effectively practice a different policy than it claims to espouse. So the aspiration of the Irish Language Act, replacement of the transfer test, the reduction of local councils from 26 to 11, and the way in which policing and justice was devolved, all involved a failure to achieve their preferred option, although this view is as much DUP propaganda than an objective consideration of how much Sinn Féin has achieved or failed to achieve in a governing system that has seen all parties climb down on their policy preferences. It might be argued by Sinn Féin and indeed their critics that Sinn Féin has not changed policy at all, but simply adopted pragmatic strategies that are best suited to seeing the implementation of their overarching policy ambition of United Ireland. This has been seen most recently in the bid for the Irish presidency by Martin McGuinness, where he took positions that marked a significant departure from the past, an acceptance of the Irish Defence Forces and not the IRA as a legitimate army of Ireland, an acceptance that he would meet with the British royal family if he became president, and an indication that the IRA was guilty of murder on occasions. For critics from all sides, this question will lead to the view that Sinn Féin has not actually changed policy, but simply engaged in an elaborate set of strategies designed to meet its ultimate constitutional aims. A view being expressed about the strategy and policies of Sinn Féin is that they have lost momentum after the early glow of getting into government, extracting concessions of policing, justice and equality, but then running out of steam. It wasn't meant to be like this. Sinn Féin's strategy was to move so quickly that it would never hit the ground. It would speedily enter the government north and south, enabling it to squeeze unionists from both sides of the All-Ireland bodies and make the prospect of United Ireland by 2016 look less of a hopeless case than it does now. Adam's strategy has come unstuck. Sinn Féin has made gains and suffered setbacks, and now has become ironically part of the northern establishment, but only a part that can operate by working in close conjunction with its supposed ideological enemies, the DUP. An illustration has occurred on the Hearts and Minds programme. Ian Paisley Jr. of the DUP touched on the sore point when he was asked what it was like working in government with Sinn Féin. While I'm not saying I would prefer to see Sinn Féin in government because they are a soft touch, I believe that if the SDLP had more people there, we wouldn't be able to get away with some of the things that we've been able to get away with. DUP spin perhaps, but there's a sense that the strategy and policies of Sinn Féin have reached a major obstacle. It was only in 2001 that Gerry Adams was confidently predicting a united Ireland by the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising. He said the logic of the peace process would lead to unification, perhaps by the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising, which was seen as a turning point for Irish nationalism. By 2007, Adams was backpedalling and telling Eugene Reevey, "This party never had a position of achieving this by 2016. It will happen when sufficient political and public support has been attained. Bear in mind that under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, the Government of Ireland Act, which was scrapped and replaced with a new constitutional arrangement, the British government is now committed to legislating for United Ireland if a majority of the citizens in the North want it." So, effectively, Sinn Féin, it could be said, from their point of view, has retained their fundamental policy ambitions of a United Ireland and a particular type of United Ireland, but through a peace process and strategy and a degree of pragmatism has had to compromise to a point where its critics would say that essentially is fundamentally changed and probably set apart for quite a considerable period of time its ultimate policy ambitions.